The town of Harrow Falls had a way of making outsiders feel it. Not with cruelty exactly, more with a studied indifference, the kind practiced by places that had learned long ago that strangers rarely stayed, and the ones who did almost always regretted it. The diner on Main Street opened at 6 and closed at 9, and in between it served pancakes and truck-stop coffee and the particular silence of a place where the same 12 people had been eating the same meals for 30 years. Clara had been working the morning shift for 11 weeks, and in that time no one had learned her last name or asked how she'd come to be there. Renting the cheapest room at Mrs. Bedell's house on Elm Street and walking the half-mile to work in a coat that kept the wind out, but not the cold. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to. She was 19. That was the whole of it in the beginning. The single fact that defined her in the town's eyes on the rare occasions it looked at her at all. 19 and obviously alone. Obviously not from here. Obviously the kind of girl who showed up in small Vermont towns in November without a car or a winter coat adequate to the altitude. She wore a second-hand parka she'd bought for $6 at the Goodwill in Burlington before the bus north, and she'd learned to move fast between the parking lot and the diner door. She'd learned to appreciate the blast of hot air that hit when she pulled it open, overheated and smelling like a place that had been cooking the same things for decades. Her first week, the cook, a man named Derry with no perceptible interest in anything, had looked her over and asked where she was from. She'd said she was from a few different places. He'd nodded and gone back to the grill, and that was the end of any conversation between them that wasn't about orders. The owner, Peg Halverson, was 60-something and ran the diner the way a ship captain runs a vessel in heavy weather, with absolute authority, no sentiment, and a clear hierarchy of who mattered and who didn't. Clara was at the bottom, not because Peg was cruel, she wasn't, but because she understood something Clara was still learning. You earned a place in a town like this over years, sometimes over generations. 11 weeks was nothing. 11 weeks was barely enough to justify knowing someone's name. Clara knew this. She'd grown up knowing versions of it in 11 different houses across 4 different counties in Vermont and one stretch in New Hampshire that she preferred not to think about. The math of belonging had always been the same. You arrived. They assessed. They reserved judgment. And then, sometimes never, they let you in. Most places she'd been, she'd left before the verdict came in. Harrow Falls was the first place she'd chosen herself. She'd picked it off a map on the library computer in Burlington the afternoon she aged out. October 14th, which was a Tuesday, and the social worker, a woman named Trish with tired eyes and a caseload that kept her running, had handed Clara a folder with information about transitional housing and food assistance programs and a list of organizations that helped young adults who'd been in the system. Clara had taken the folder and thanked her with genuine warmth because Trish had always been decent to her. And then she'd sat in the library for 3 hours, looking at the state map on the screen, and finally pointed to a dot in the northeast corner and thought, that one. The way you pick a name for something that has no name yet. Instinct and nothing else. She'd had $412, saved from the part-time job at the grocery store that had been part of her last placement's conditions for staying. The family had been fine, not terrible, not particularly warm, but fine. She'd worked, saved, done her homework at the kitchen table while the household moved around her, and in the end she'd left on the appointed day with her bag and her money and no one's personal contact information except Trish's work number, which was the same as leaving with nothing. The rooming house cost $210 a month. She'd found the diner job the second day. She kept it because Peg paid cash on Fridays and asked no questions about paperwork, and Clara's paperwork situation was complicated in ways she didn't have the energy to explain. The room at Mrs. Bedell's was 8 feet by 10, with a window that faced the back garden and a radiator that banged at irregular intervals through the night. The bed was narrow. The shared bathroom on the second floor always smelled faintly of mildew, no matter how often Clara wiped down the shower. She'd hung one thing on the wall, a postcard she'd carried for 4 years, a reproduction of a painting she'd torn from a magazine at one of the group homes. A winter landscape, snow covering everything, a line of bare trees, and somewhere in the middle distance a light in a window. She'd looked at it for years and never been able to say exactly what it meant to her, only that it meant something. By December the cold had gotten serious. The kind of cold that Harrow Falls natives spoke about with something approaching pride. A weather phenomenon so consistent and extreme that it functioned as a sorting mechanism, weeding out the ones who couldn't handle it, leaving only the committed or the trapped. Clara fell into neither category exactly. She was something else, something that didn't have a word. She worked the morning shift and spent her afternoons in the library, which was warm and had good internet, and a librarian named Dorothea who left her alone. She ate one real meal a day, usually at the diner before her shift ended, whatever dairy had made too much of and didn't mind her taking. She slept as many hours as the banging radiator allowed. She read everything she could get her hands on, history and biology and novels, and once, memorably, a technical manual for gemstone cutting that she'd checked out by accident and ended up finishing because it turned out to be one of the most beautiful things she'd ever read. The precision of it, the way it described light moving through stone. She told no one in Harrow Falls anything about herself. Not because she was secretive, but because no one had asked, and the habit of not volunteering was one she developed early and maintained carefully. In 11 different homes you learned which information was safe and which wasn't. You learned, most fundamentally, that your history was yours to hold or release as you chose, and that most people who asked weren't as interested in the answer as they were in the performance of caring. December 14th was the morning of the feathers. She'd woken before the alarm, which happened sometimes when the cold was bad enough to penetrate even sleep. The window above her bed was frosted over on the inside, a fine crackling of ice across the glass that caught the streetlight from outside. She lay there for a moment, listening to the silence, which in Harrow Falls in winter was a specific kind of silence, thick and muffled by snow and distance, without wind on mornings this cold, without sound of any kind. When she moved to look at the window, she saw it. A white feather, resting against the glass on the outer sill, barely visible through the frost, but unmistakably there. She could see its outline, the slight curl of the vein, the way it lay absolutely still against the sill despite the temperature outside that would have frozen a person's fingers in minutes. She stared at it. Then she dressed, layered everything she had, both pairs of socks and the thermal undershirt, and the parka and the wool hat that had a hole in it she kept meaning to mend, and she went downstairs and outside into the blue-black cold of the early morning. The feather was large, larger than she'd thought from above, snow-white with the faintest gray at the tip. A wing feather, possibly from a barn owl or something larger. She picked it up carefully. It was lighter than she expected, impossibly light, and completely dry despite the frost around it. She stood there in the back garden with the feather in her hand, her breath coming in clouds, looking at the print it had left in the light dusting of new snow on the sill. Then she saw the second one. It was at the garden gate. Another white feather, identical in color, slightly smaller, lying in the snow at the base of the latch. She walked to it without deciding to. She picked it up. She looked beyond the gate at the alley that ran behind the rooming houses, which ended in a field stretching toward the wood line a quarter-mile away. There was another feather at the end of the alley. She knew, even as she followed it, that what she was doing was strange. She knew it because she was a practical person, or tried to be, who did not believe in signs and had no particular relationship with mysticism. She'd been passed through too many households with different theologies, different superstitions, different ideas about what the universe meant by its various arrangements, to have settled on any of them. But she also had a habit, which she'd recognized in herself years ago, of following the things that pulled at her without quite knowing why. The gemstone manual she'd checked out by mistake. The map in the Burlington Library. This was something like that. She followed the feathers across the field. They led toward the woods, spaced 40 or 50 feet apart, each one lying flat in the snow as though placed rather than dropped, oriented always in the direction of the next. Some were half buried, and she had to look carefully to find them. And twice she almost turned back because the cold was becoming serious, and she had not eaten breakfast, and her shift started at 6, and it was already past 5. But each time she found the next feather before she'd fully decided to give up. The woods at the field's edge were old-growth pine, the kind that went back further than anyone in town could say. The floor was bare of brush under the dense canopy, the light inside different from the open field, blue and muted, the snow on the ground unbroken except for animal tracks Clara couldn't read. She was not a person who knew the woods. She'd grown up in towns. Always. and the natural world had been something she observed from windows or walked through without comprehension. But the feathers continued inside the tree line, and she followed them in. The path, if it could be called that, wound northwest for what she estimated was 1.5 miles, though in the woods without landmarks it was hard to be certain. The pines were enormous, some of them easily 4 feet across at the base. Their lower branches spread wide and close together, so the snow barely reached the ground beneath them. The light had begun to shift from blue to pale gray by the time the trees thinned, and she stepped into a clearing she had not expected. The cabin sat at the far edge of the clearing, backed against the slope of a hill that rose steeply behind it. Built from log and stone, not new but not derelict, somewhere in the long middle ground between the two. The logs had weathered to a dark gray, the chinking between them intact, if not fresh. The roof was steep-pitched and buried under 2 feet of snow, but the underlying structure looked solid. A stone chimney rose at the far end, cold, no smoke. The windows were shuttered from outside with heavy wooden panels, each one fastened with a bolt that had rusted to the color of old blood. The door was set deep in its frame, solid timber with iron hardware, padlocked twice over. One lock at the handle, and one at a hasp staple set near the top, both of them heavy and old, and sealed with rust that suggested years, possibly many years. Clara stood at the clearing's edge and looked at it. The last feather lay in the snow between her and the door, roughly in the center of the clearing, pointing toward the cabin like an arrow someone had left for exactly this moment. She crossed to it, picked it up, held it with the others she'd collected. 7 total. She stood 10 feet from the door and looked at the padlocks and the shuttered windows and the snow banked against the base of the wall where no one had walked in a very long time. Then she looked up. The owl was on the roof. She saw it before she fully understood what she was seeing, a white shape against the white snow, so still it might have been a piece of ice except that it was shaped wrong for ice. It watched her with yellow eyes that were the only warm color in the entire clearing. It was enormous, a snowy owl, the largest she'd ever seen, and it sat at the peak of the roof with the absolute stillness of something that had been there a long time and expected to remain. She watched it. It watched her. Neither moved for what felt like several minutes. Then it spread its wings, once, slowly, like someone opening a book, and settled them again. It made no sound. Clara turned back to the door. She was not, in any practical sense, going to break into a locked cabin in the woods. She understood this even as she examined the padlocks, crouching in the snow, brushing rust dust from the hasp. What she was doing was looking. She'd been carried 1.5 miles through the cold on nothing but a line of feathers, and she intended to at least understand what she'd found. The lower padlock was an older model, a brand she didn't recognize, with a keyhole standard enough that she wondered about the key. Not that she had one. She didn't carry tools of any kind. What she had in her coat pocket was a library card, her phone with 11% battery, and 7 white owl feathers. She stood. She walked around the cabin's perimeter, the snow up to her knees on the north side where the hill caught the wind and piled drifts. The back wall had no windows, no door, nothing but the meeting of log and stone and the shoulder of the hill rising just behind. The east wall had a single shuttered window. The west wall had a woodshed attached, empty of wood, its door hanging open on one hinge, the interior holding nothing but a rusted axe head and some rope that had rotted through. Inside the woodshed, on the wall between the shed and the cabin proper, she found a small hatch. It was low, roughly 2 feet square, set flush with the logs, and almost invisible beneath years of grime and cobwebs. Built to allow access to a crawl space or a pipe chase. There was no lock on it, just a simple wooden turn catch that had swollen in its fitting from moisture and time. She worked at it for 4 minutes with numb fingers before it gave. The hatch opened into darkness and cold and the smell of old wood and something she couldn't name, something faint and mineral, like stone that had never seen sun. She couldn't see more than 2 feet inside. She had her phone's flashlight, but at 11% she was reluctant to use it. What she did was push the hatch all the way open, let her eyes adjust, and lean in far enough to see what she could. A wall. A floor. The interior of the cabin, dark and sealed, smelling of years. And on the floor just inside, scattered in the dust and the faint light coming through the hatch, something that caught even the dim winter light and threw it back. Glass. Or crystal. Or something that behaved like crystal, something that refracted what little light reached it into faint prismatic edges, the kind of effect she'd never seen in ordinary glass. She was shaking now, partly from cold and partly from something else she didn't have a word for. She pulled back from the hatch. She checked her phone. 4:47 in the morning. She had a little over an hour before her shift started. She took a photograph of the hatch with her phone, then the cabin, then the clearing, then the feathers in her hand. Then she closed the hatch as well as she could and stood up and looked at the owl, which had moved to the woodshed roof and was watching her with the same patient attention. She walked back through the woods with the feathers in her hand and her mind working through the problem steadily. There was a cabin. Someone owned it. It had been locked for what looked like a very long time. Something inside caught the light in a way that ordinary glass didn't. She needed to know who it belonged to. The town records office opened at 9. She was at the diner by 6, working her shift with her usual focused efficiency, refilling coffee and taking orders and carrying plates through the narrow space between tables while the morning regulars ate and talked about the weather and the state of the roads and the price of heating oil. She was good at the work, quick and reliable, and Peg had told her twice, in the clipped way Peg told people anything, that she was better than most of the girls she'd hired, which Clara understood was the closest Peg came to warm approval. She left at 2, as the lunch crowd thinned, and walked the 6 blocks to the town hall in cold that had deepened through the day rather than softened. The records office was a small room off the main corridor, staffed by a man named Walter Greer, who was in his mid-60s and organized the physical filing system with a devotion that bordered on religious. He looked up when she came in and said yes, with the patient manner of someone who'd answered too many questions to show impatience anymore. She said she was looking for information about a cabin in the pine woods northwest of town, on the back slope of the hill locals called Greer's Ridge. He said that was named after his father, who'd homesteaded the upper ridge back in the 50s. And yes, he knew the property she was describing. It had changed hands a few times over the decades. He pulled the file. Himself. He was that kind of records keeper, the kind who knew where everything was without consulting the system, who'd been there long enough to carry the index in his head. The cabin on Greer's Ridge, he told her, had been built in 1947 by a man named Avery Whitmore, who'd come up from Massachusetts and bought 40 acres of timber land and built the cabin by hand over the course of a summer. Avery had lived there, part of the year at least, until 1971, when he deeded the property to his son, Elias Whitmore. Clara's hands were cold. She pressed them flat against the counter. Elias Whitmore had owned the cabin from 1971 until his death in 2019. There had been a dispute about the estate, which had gone into probate, and the cabin was currently held in escrow by a trust administered by an attorney named James Felder, whose office was on Birch Street. She wrote down the name and the address. Walter said, before she left, that he'd known Elias Whitmore a little. Not well, but Elias had come up from his primary residence in Burlington to spend time at the cabin 2 or 3 times a year, always in winter, always alone. He'd been a quiet man, polite when you spoke to him, but not someone who sought conversation. He'd had a reputation in certain circles as an expert in something to do with stones. Gemstones, Walter said, tilting his head. He worked with gemstones, I think. Some kind of specialist. Or collector. I couldn't tell you which. Clara thanked him and left. She stood on the sidewalk outside the town hall with the cold settling around her and her heart moving faster than it should have been. Elias Whitmore. Gemstones. A cabin sealed since, she guessed, somewhere around 2019, when he died. An estate in probate. An attorney holding the trust. Whitmore. She carried her birth certificate in the zippered interior pocket of her parka because it was one of 3 documents that were entirely hers, along with her social security card and a piece of paper that had her mother's name on it, given to her by a social worker when she was 12 who'd said, I thought you should have this. Her mother's name, her mother's date of birth and date of death, and her mother's maiden name, Whitmore. Sylvie and Whitmore. The cold was absolute. She stood in it and breathed slowly and did not let herself run to any conclusion, yet, because she'd been disappointed before, many times, by things that seemed to fit and didn't. But Whitmore was not a common name. It was not a name she'd ever encountered outside the documents she carried. And her mother, dead since Clara was 3, had been a Whitmore from somewhere in Vermont. She went back to the library. Dorothea was at the desk and didn't look up when Clara came in, which was exactly the kind of not looking that left room to breathe. Clara sat at the far computer and searched for Elias Whitmore, gemologist, Burlington, Vermont. What came back was spare but informative. Elias Whitmore had been known within specialist circles as an independent gemologist and colored stone collector, not famous in the broad sense, but respected among people who worked in the field. He'd been certified by the Gemological Institute of America and had worked for several decades as a consultant and appraiser for auction houses and private collectors. He'd written 2 papers on alexandrite that had been cited widely within the gemological literature. He'd been something of a recluse in his later years, according to a brief profile in a Vermont arts and culture publication from 2012, a man who found more meaning in the interior life of stones than in the company of most people. The profile mentioned that he had a daughter, Sylvie, who had predeceased him. She read the sentence 3 times. He had a daughter, Sylvie. She checked her own documents. Her mother, Sylvie and Whitmore. Date of death, March 2007. She sat with this for a long time. Long enough that the library's afternoon light shifted and Dorothea came through with a cart of books to reshelve, and the heat clicked on with a sound like a cough, and outside the windows the early Vermont dark began to settle. Elias Whitmore had been her grandfather, or at the very least, the Elias Whitmore who'd owned the cabin and worked with gemstones and had a daughter named Sylvie was almost certainly her grandfather, because the alternative was a coincidence of a scale she couldn't accept. Which meant the cabin in the woods was hers, or might be hers, or might be something she had a claim to, or might be something that a probate court and an attorney named Felder had already decided she had no part in. She didn't know. She'd never had occasion to learn how estates worked. She walked back to Mrs. Bedell's rooming house in the dark. She ate the half-sleeve of crackers she had in her room and drank water from the bathroom tap and lay on the narrow bed and looked at the winter landscape postcard on the wall and thought about the cabin and the 7 white feathers she'd lined up on the windowsill. She thought about the thing she'd seen on the cabin floor through the crawlspace hatch, the thing that caught light and threw it back. She slept badly and woke early. The next morning, she went to James Felder's office on Birch Street before her shift. Felder and Associates occupied the ground floor of a Victorian building that had been divided into professional offices, the kind of place that communicated competence by being slightly shabby in a deliberate way. Prints on the walls of covered bridges and maple trees, carpet that had once been expensive and was now just old. A receptionist with reading glasses and a careful neutrality asked Clara's name and whether she had an appointment. She didn't. She explained that she was there about the Whitmore estate, that she believed she might have standing as a family member, and that she'd appreciate 5 minutes with Mr. Felder if he was available. The receptionist said she'd check. She disappeared through a door. She came back 2 minutes later and said Mr. Felder could give her 10 minutes at 11:30, which was in 45 minutes. Clara said thank you and sat in a chair that faced the window and watched Birch Street while she waited. James Felder was in his 50s, heavy-set and tired-looking, with the specific tiredness of a man who handled other people's problems as his primary occupation. He shook her hand with courtesy that didn't quite conceal the assessment underneath. He looked at her the way she'd been looked at many times over the years, taking in the second-hand coat and the age and the absence of anyone accompanying her, arriving at conclusions she suspected were incomplete. She put her birth certificate and the paper with her mother's information on his desk before he could ask anything. She said, "My mother was Sylvie Ann Whitmore. I believe she was the daughter of Elias Whitmore, who owned property in Harrow Falls. I'm looking for information about his estate." Felder looked at the documents. He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression that she couldn't fully read. He was quiet for long enough that she felt the first stirring of something uncomfortable. Then he said, "Where have you been?" She told him. Not everything, but the essential facts. Foster care since she was 3. No known relatives. No one had ever contacted her about any family connection. Felder pressed his fingers together and looked at a point above her head for a moment. Then he opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a file, thick and worn at the edges, the kind of file that had been taken out and put back many times. He said, "I've been trying to find you for 3 years." The office was warm, but she felt cold. She said, "What?" He opened the file. He laid several documents on the desk between them. A handwritten letter. A photograph. A section of what appeared to be a legal document with her name in it. Or rather, the name Clara Whitmore, which was the name she'd been born with before the system gave her the surname Voss, the surname of the first foster family, which had simply stayed attached to her through all the placements because no one had ever had a reason to change it back. The letter was addressed to her mother, Sylvie, and was dated 2001. The photograph was a woman she'd never seen before, or rather, a woman she recognized the way you recognize someone in a dream, not from life, but from some layer beneath life. Dark hair, light eyes, a way of holding her shoulders that Clara saw sometimes in mirrors when she forgot to arrange herself for other people. Her mother at maybe 22, standing in front of a building she didn't recognize, squinting into sunlight, almost but not quite smiling. Clara put her fingertip on the edge of the photograph. She didn't pick it up. Felder said, "Your grandfather left the estate to you. It's written into his will, which was filed in 2016, 3 years before his death. He left everything to Clara Whitmore, daughter of Sylvie and Whitmore, to be held in trust until she could be located. He hired me specifically to find you." He paused. "You're the first member of your family to walk into my office without anyone having to bring you here." She thought about the feathers. She thought about the owl on the roof. She said, "I found the cabin yesterday morning, in the woods northwest of town." Felder was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should tell you that the estate is somewhat more complex than a cabin and 40 acres of land." She waited. He said, "Your grandfather was, by any measure, a significant collector. He worked for 50 years in the colored stone market, and he was very good at it. He acquired things over those decades that he stored partly in his Burlington residence, which has been inventoried and valued during probate, and partly at the Harrow Falls cabin, which has not been inventoried because we've been unable to gain entry. The locks are keyed to a system he designed himself, and he left the access information only in documents sealed inside the cabin. He said in his will that whoever found the property and loved it would find the way inside." She thought about the crawlspace hatch. She said, "There's a small hatch on the west wall, inside the woodshed. It's not locked." Felder looked at her for a long moment. He said, "I think you'd better come back this afternoon. We have a great deal to discuss." She was late to her shift by 6 minutes. Peg said nothing when she came in, just looked at her once and handed her the order pad. Clara worked the rest of the morning in a state she could only describe as suspended. Not quite real, not quite not. She refilled coffee and carried plates and smiled when people spoke to her and kept her hands steady through pure will. At 2, she went home and sat on the narrow bed and looked at the postcard on the wall for a long time. She went back to Felder's office at 3. The second conversation lasted 2 hours and covered things that Clara had no framework for, things she had to ask him to repeat, and then explain, and then repeat again until they settled into something approaching comprehension. Elias Whitmore's estate, he told her, had been valued during the Burlington residence portion of probate at approximately $47 million. This covered the contents of the primary residence, gemstones cataloged and appraised, artworks, precious metals, and various financial instruments. The cabin in the woods had not been included in this valuation because no one had gotten inside. Felder said this with a particular care, which she understood meant that the cabin was expected to be significant. She asked how significant. He said, "Your grandfather's records, the ones he kept at the Burlington house, indicate that he considered the Harrow Falls property his primary repository, his personal archive. He called it that in his journals. He said the Burlington house was where he lived. The Harrow Falls cabin was where he kept what mattered most." She asked, "And nobody's been inside since he died?" He said, "He designed it that way. The locks are biometric, keyed to his handprint, and were switched to a secondary mechanical system upon his death, a system that requires a key he left sealed inside the cabin. He wrote in his will that the person who found the property would find the key. He said it was waiting for the right person." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The hatch." Yes, she'd seen something on the floor through the hatch. She'd assumed it was glass. Now she thought about what it might actually have been, given who her grandfather was, given what he collected, given the phrasing, primary archive, what mattered most. Felder said, "I want to be very clear with you, Miss Whitmore. Your legal standing as heir is strong, but it will need to be formally established. DNA verification will be required by the court. The probate process for the cabin contents will be separate from the Burlington estate, which is already largely resolved. And I have to tell you that there are parties who have contested aspects of the estate. She asked who. He said there was an attorney in Burlington representing a property development company called Crestline Holdings that had been attempting to acquire the mineral rights attached to the Harrow Falls acreage for the past 4 years. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. The 40 acres included underground mining rights to a mineral deposit that hadn't been fully assessed when Elias purchased the land in the 70s, which he'd known about and held on to deliberately for reasons that had become clear only after his death, when a geological survey commissioned by the estate found that the deposit was substantially larger than initial assessments had suggested. She asked what kind of mineral deposit. Feldspar and mica, primarily, but also a vein of corundum running through the eastern portion of the acreage that extended, according to the survey, well beyond the property boundary into adjacent land already assessed. A gemologist, he said, understood better than anyone what a corundum vein meant. Corundum in gem quality was sapphire. Corundum with chromium impurities was ruby. She absorbed this slowly. She said, "My grandfather owned land with ruby and sapphire deposits." Felder said, "Your grandfather owned land with gem-quality corundum deposits that a mining company has been trying to acquire through legal pressure for the past 4 years. Your grandfather's will, however, prohibits any sale of the mineral rights for a period of 25 years after his death. Crestline Holdings has been contesting that provision." She asked if they could win. He said, "Not easily, but they have resources and they're patient. The longer the estate remains in limbo, the stronger their position becomes. Your appearing today changes the calculus significantly. A direct heir with a strong legal claim can move the probate to resolution in a way that the trust alone cannot." She sat with all of this for a long time. Outside Felder's window, the streetlights of Birch Street had come on in the early dark, and the snow was falling steadily, and Harrow Falls looked, from this small warm office, exactly like a painting. Like the postcard on her wall. Like a winter landscape with a light in the window. She said, "What do I need to do first?" Felder said, "DNA. We'll need a sample from you, and we'll need to match it against material from your grandfather's Burlington residence. His personal effects include biological material the court will accept for testing. Results take 2 to 3 weeks. In the meantime, I'll file a motion to establish you as the presumptive heir and to formally suspend any further action by Crestline Holdings while the hereditary claim is resolved." She said, "And the cabin?" He said, "The cabin is yours to enter once your claim is established. Until then, legally, you should not go inside." She understood. She said she understood. She walked home through the snow with the 7 feathers in her pocket and her mind moving steadily through what she'd been told, sorting it into what was certain and what was possible and what she needed to do about each. Her grandfather had been real. He had known she existed. He had looked for her. He had written her name into his will. He had stored the most important things he owned in a cabin in the woods and sealed it and left instructions that the right person would find the way inside. She didn't know yet what the inside held. She had an idea based on what she'd glimpsed through the hatch, based on what Felder had told her about the Burlington estate valuation, based on what she'd read about her grandfather's decades of work in the colored stone market. But she wouldn't know for certain until she was inside. The 3 weeks that followed were the longest of her life, which was saying something given that she'd spent significant portions of her childhood in states of enforced waiting. Waiting for placement decisions. waiting for court dates, waiting to learn where she'd be going next. She'd gotten good at filling waiting time with work, with reading, with the small practical activities that kept a life functioning without requiring much of the future. She started eating breakfast at the diner before her shift instead of after it, which meant the cook sometimes left her a plate of eggs without being asked, which she understood was a form of kindness in the dairy idiom, unacknowledged and unburdened by sentiment. She read every book in the library's small collection related to gemstones and mineralogy, which turned out to be 4 books, none of them recent, but which contained enough information to begin sketching an understanding of what her grandfather had spent his life working with. Corundum, she read, was the second hardest natural mineral after diamond. In its gem-quality transparent form, colored blue by traces of iron and titanium, it was sapphire. Colored red by chromium, it was ruby. Colored any other shade, which happened more often than people expected, it was referred to as fancy sapphire. Pink, orange, violet, green, yellow, and colors that resisted any single name. The most valuable colored stones in the world were not diamonds. They were the finest rubies, which could sell for prices that exceeded any diamond of comparable size, and the finest alexandrites, which changed color under different lighting conditions and were so rare that most jewelers never handled one in a career. Her grandfather had spent 50 years working with these things. He'd written papers on alexandrite specifically. He'd been recognized within his field as one of a small number of independent specialists with genuine expertise in the colored stone market. She thought about this in the mornings while she refilled coffee, and in the afternoons in the library, and at night on the narrow bed with the radiator banging. She thought about the things she'd seen through the hatch, which she'd assumed was broken glass, but which she now understood with a quiet certainty could have been something else entirely. She went back to Walter at the records office twice during the 3 weeks. Not to ask about the property, which she now knew the essentials of, but to ask about Elias as a person. Walter thought about it with the care he brought to filing, which was to say with a great deal of precision and no wasted movement. He said, he came up in winter, mostly. January, February sometimes. He'd come into the store for supplies. Not much. He cooked simply from what I could tell, and he'd stop in here sometimes to look at the old land records. He was interested in the history of the ridge. Who'd owned what and when, going back to when Harrow Falls was first settled. He said once that a landscape didn't really make sense unless you understood what had happened in it over time. That the stone remembered even when the people forgot. She asked, did he talk about family? Walter was quiet for a moment. He said, once. Once he said something about a daughter. Said she'd gone in a direction he hadn't expected. That she'd needed to find her own way, and he'd let her go when maybe he should have held on. Then he picked up his coffee, and we talked about something else. She sat with this. She thought about her mother at 22, standing in front of that building in the photograph, squinting into sunlight. Not quite smiling. Her mother, who had left a family home for reasons Clara would probably never fully know, and who had died when Clara was 3, and who had not, apparently, told anyone about Clara's existence until it was too late for Elias to find her through official channels. What she felt when she thought about her mother was something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite anger. Something quieter than both. A sense of all the versions of a life that hadn't happened. Not recrimination. Just the weight of what could have been, which was its own kind of heavy. On December 28th, she drove to Burlington in Mrs. Bedell's ancient Subaru, which the landlady lent without excessive commentary when Clara explained she needed to go to the city for legal matters. She went to the Burlington Public Library and asked for access to their archive of the Burlington Free Press going back 30 years. She was looking for mentions of Elias Whitmore. There were 8. 3 were brief notices of his participation in gemological conferences in the late 80s and 90s. 1 was a short profile in a business section piece about Vermont-based independent specialists in luxury markets, dated 2001. 2 were obituary-adjacent pieces following his death in 2019. 1 was from 2004, a short article about a legal case Elias had been involved in as an expert witness, a fraud case in which he testified about the authenticity of a collection of colored stones that had been misrepresented by a dealer. In the 2001 profile, there was a quote that stopped her. The reporter had asked him what he loved about his work. He'd said, "Every stone is a record. Every inclusion, every feature, Every quirk of color and clarity is information about the conditions that made the stone possible. When you look at a fine ruby, you're looking at the evidence of enormous pressure and heat, of millions of years of exactly the right circumstances occurring in exactly the right sequence. I find that perspective useful when I'm having a difficult day. The stone that's in front of you required more than you can imagine. And here it is. She read the passage twice in the library in Burlington and thought about her grandfather sitting across from her, which was something that had not happened and could not happen now. She thought about the cabin in the woods and the sealed door and the feathers on the windowsill at the rooming house. The results from the DNA testing came back on January 7th. Felder called her at 9 in the morning while she was at the diner, and she stepped outside into the cold to take the call, standing on the salted sidewalk with her apron still on. He said, "The results confirm the familial relationship. You are Elias Whitmore's biological grandchild. Sylvie and Whitmore was your mother. The court has been notified and your status as primary heir is formally established." He paused. "Clara, I want to say something that isn't strictly legal advice. Your grandfather spent 3 years trying to find you. He didn't stop believing it was possible. He just kept trying." She said, "I know." He said, "I thought you should hear it said plainly. He knew you were out there. He kept looking." She thanked him and went back inside and worked the rest of her shift and didn't cry. Or not exactly. Though there was a moment around 10 o'clock, when the morning rush had thinned and she was standing at the service window waiting for Derry to finish an order, when something moved through her that was large and warm and old. Like a door opening in a part of the house she hadn't known was there. They scheduled the cabin opening for January 10th. She had 3 days. She spent them working her shifts and doing things she'd been putting off since October, small acts of maintenance that a person who expects to be somewhere for a while undertakes without particularly noticing. She mended the hole in her wool hat with thread Mrs. Bedell left on the kitchen table the morning after Clara had mentioned, in passing, that she should probably fix it. She returned every library book she had out and checked out nothing new, which felt appropriate somehow, as though what was coming would require space she hadn't yet made room for. She called Trish's work number and was told by a recording that the number was no longer in service. She tried the agency's main line and was put on hold twice, and then told that the caseworker assigned to her file was no longer with the organization. She left her current contact information with the administrative assistant. "For the record," she said, "for anyone who needs to know where I am." On the evening of January 9th, she sat on the bed in the narrow room and looked at the postcard on the wall for what she suspected would be the last time she looked at it in this particular place and context. The winter landscape. The light in the window. She'd carried this image for 4 years and looked at it through 4 different homes and a rooming house room, and she'd never been able to say what it meant, only that it meant something. Now she thought she had a better idea. It looked like the clearing with the cabin in it. Not precisely. The trees were different, and the building was different, and the proportions were off. But the feeling of it was the same. A structure in the snow, sealed against winter, holding inside it something warm and waiting. The light in a window that someone else might mistake for emptiness. She took the postcard off the wall and set it carefully on the windowsill beside the 7 feathers, which were still there, still white, still impossibly light. She'd checked on them every morning since the 14th, and they hadn't deteriorated at all, which she chose not to examine too carefully. She thought about her grandfather sitting in the cabin on winter visits, cataloging stones, writing in the journals Felder had mentioned, understanding that somewhere in the state a granddaughter existed whom he hadn't been able to find and might never find, and had chosen nonetheless to believe in. She thought about what that kind of faith cost a person, the daily practice of it, the refusal to resolve the uncertainty by simply closing the door on it. He did for me what I never had anyone do, she thought. And she didn't mean materially. She meant the other thing, which was harder to name. The act of holding space for someone, of treating their existence as a fact worth organizing your life around, even when you couldn't see or touch or verify that existence. In every home she'd been in, the question underneath everything had been whether she was worth the trouble, whether her presence justified the disruption, whether she'd prove out to be the kind of person who warranted investment. Elias Whitmore had answered that question in 2016, when she was 12 years old, with no evidence that she was findable or that she would be anything in particular when found. He'd put her name in a legal document and meant it. She lay down and looked at the ceiling and listened to the radiator and let herself feel the full weight of that. Outside, the snow was falling again. In the north, beyond the dark town, beyond the field and the pine woods and the ridge, the cabin sat in its clearing with its shuttered windows and its sealed door, holding everything her grandfather had called most important. Waiting, as it had been waiting for years, for the right person to find the way inside. She thought she understood now why he'd used that phrase. The right person wasn't a mystical category. It wasn't about deserving or being chosen or any of the frameworks the world applied to sudden reversals of fortune. It was something simpler. The person who followed the feathers. The person who checked the hatch. The person who asked who it belonged to and then drove to Burlington on an icy road and sat in a library archive and read the words he'd spoken in a newspaper in 2001. The stone that's in front of you required more than you can imagine. And here it is. She fell asleep to the sound of snow on the window. And in the morning, she put on every layer she owned and went to Felder's office on Birch Street. And together they drove up the fire road in his four-wheel drive through the pine woods to the clearing where the owl sat on the cabin roof, watching them arrive with its patient yellow-eyed attention, as though it had known they were coming, as though it had been waiting exactly this long. The fire road ended at a turnaround 100 yards short of the clearing, and from there they walked, Felder ahead in good boots and a parka that had cost more than Clara's first month of rent, Clara behind him in the second-hand coat with the 7 feathers in her interior pocket because she hadn't been able to leave them at the rooming house, hadn't been able to look at them on the windowsill that morning and think about not bringing them with her. The path was unbroken snow, knee-deep in places, and Felder picked his way through it without complaint or commentary. The owl was on the roof when they came into the clearing. The same owl, or the same kind of owl, or some category of owl Clara had stopped trying to interpret. It looked at them with the same patience it had shown her 3 weeks ago. Felder paused when he saw it. He glanced at Clara with an expression she couldn't fully read. He said, in a quieter voice than he'd been using, "That's a snowy. They don't usually come this far south. Not this time of year." Clara said, "It was here when I found the place." Felder looked at the bird for another moment, and then at the cabin and then at Clara. He didn't say anything else about it. He had with him a small toolkit, which contained, among other things, a bolt cutter that he carried in a leather case at his belt the way some men carried sidearms. He'd explained on the drive that the court had authorized professional removal of the exterior padlocks, and that he was qualified by some technicality of his bar license to perform the work himself, which Clara understood to mean he'd handled situations like this before. He cut the lower padlock first. The bolt cutter went through the rusted hasp with surprisingly little resistance, the steel giving way after 50-some years of weather with what sounded like a single soft cough. The lock fell into the snow at his feet. He picked it up and put it in the leather case. The upper lock was harder. It was newer than the lower one, and the rust on it was only superficial. Underneath, the metal was still sound. He worked at it for 2 minutes before the cutter found the angle. Then it gave. The door itself was simple after the locks were off. Felder turned the iron handle. The hinges complained in a low, animal way, and then the door swung inward. The cold inside was different from the cold outside. The outside cold was active, alive, pushing against you. The inside cold was the cold of something that had been at rest for a long time, dense and still, and smelling faintly of old wood smoke and stone and the dry neutral smell of a sealed building. They stood in the doorway and let their eyes adjust. The first room was a kind of foyer or mudroom, narrow, with hooks on the walls for coats and a bench along one side, and a metal grate on the floor for snow to melt through. Everything in it was clean and orderly. A wool coat hung from one of the hooks, dark gray, intact. A pair of leather boots sat beneath the bench, polished to a soft sheen that had survived the years. On the bench itself, a wool blanket folded in thirds. Felder said, "Don't touch anything yet. The court will want photographs." Clara nodded. She didn't think she could have touched anything anyway. The weight of being inside a space her grandfather had walked through, had lived in, had sealed deliberately the last time he'd left it, was something she needed time to absorb. They moved through to the main room. It was larger than she'd expected from the cabin's exterior, with a low-beamed ceiling and a stone fireplace that took up most of the far wall. The floor was wide plank, oiled dark. 2 armchairs faced the fireplace, both upholstered in worn green wool, with a small table between them. A bookshelf ran along one wall, full of books, most of them on subjects Clara couldn't quite identify in the low light. A writing desk sat under the east-facing window, the shutters of which were closed from the outside, leaving the room in the kind of dim gray illumination that came through the small gaps in the wood. On the desk was a fountain pen, capped, lying in a small wooden tray beside a notebook closed flat. As though he'd finished writing one evening, capped his pen, closed the notebook, and stood up to do something else. A reading lamp on the desk, a second one beside one of the armchairs. The fireplace clean and laid with kindling and split logs, ready to be lit, as though whoever set it had expected to come back soon. It was a room arranged by someone who lived alone and liked it that way. There was nothing performative about it. Everything in the room had been chosen for its function and arranged for the use of one person. It made Clara think of the rooms she'd lived in over the years, in houses arranged for the use of other people, where she'd always been an addition rather than a planning consideration. She'd never had a room that looked like this one, a room designed from the inside out by the person who lived in it. Felder gave her time. He stood in the doorway between the foyer and the main room and didn't speak and didn't move, the way a person who'd been a lawyer for 30 years had learned to give other people room when room was what they needed. Clara walked to the desk slowly, careful to leave space between herself and the things on it, careful not to disturb the precise arrangement she'd noticed and didn't want to interrupt. She looked at the closed notebook and the capped pen and the small framed photograph at the back of the desk that she had not seen at first. It was a picture of her mother, a different picture than the one in Felder's file. In this one, Sylvie was younger, maybe 16, 17. She was sitting on a porch, somewhere in summer, and someone outside the frame had said something funny, because she was laughing in that way Clara had never seen in any of the few photographs of her mother she'd ever held. A full laugh. Head tilted back slightly. The expression of a person at home in the world. Clara stood looking at the photograph for a long time. She did not pick it up. Felder said, quietly, from the doorway, "He kept that on his desk." She nodded. There was a part of her that wanted to ask Felder to leave, to give her the room alone with her mother's photograph and the closed notebook and the chair her grandfather had sat in, but a different and more practical part of her understood that this was a moment that needed witnesses, and Felder was the witness she had. So she stood for as long as she needed to stand, and then she turned away from the desk and moved into the next room. The workshop was behind the main room, accessed through a wide doorway that had been built with care, the threshold elevated slightly to keep dust from passing between the spaces. The room was smaller than the main room, but better lit by some kind of overhead arrangement Clara couldn't fully see in the dim light. A long workbench ran along the far wall, deep and solid, with built-in cabinets above and below. The surface of the bench was clean, organized, holding only a few tools laid out neatly. A pair of jeweler's tweezers, a loop in a leather case, a small set of brass tongs, a dish tray, of the kind used for sorting stones. On the wall above the bench were photographs and diagrams pinned to a cork backing. Photographs of stones, mostly. Some annotated with notes in handwriting Clara recognized from the will documents Felder had shown her, neat and precise and slightly tilted to the right. Diagrams of crystal structures. A reference card showing the Mohs hardness scale. A photograph of a single ruby, freestanding, that took up most of one corner of the cork board, the stone catching what looked like sunlight from a window not visible in the frame, the color of it so saturated it almost didn't seem real. Felder said, "That's the lion ruby. 8.5 carats. He authenticated it for an estate sale in 2008. The photograph was sent to him afterward by the family who bought it. They wrote on the back, 'Thank you for confirming what we already loved.'" Clara turned the corner of the photograph carefully. The note was still there, written in a different hand. The ink had faded, but the words were legible. She thought, he kept things people gave him. The room had a smell she couldn't quite place at first. Not the smell of the rest of the cabin, which was the smell of a closed building. Something warmer than that, more specific. After a moment she identified it. It was the smell of a workshop that had been used, over years, by a person who'd worked carefully. A faint trace of polishing compound. The dry mineral smell she'd noticed at the hatch 3 weeks ago, which she now understood was the smell of stone dust at the lowest possible concentration, accumulated over decades and held in the wood of the bench and the cabinets. The smell of a place where someone had paid attention to things for a long time. She walked the length of the workbench, careful to keep her hands at her sides. The cabinet doors above the bench were closed. The cabinet doors below were also closed. Each one had a small label on it, written in the same precise hand. References, working samples, cleaning, tools, documentation. The labels were not theatrical. They were the labels a man wrote for himself, so he wouldn't have to think about where to put things. At the far end of the workbench, against the east wall, was a door she hadn't noticed at first. It was the same dark wood as the wall, hung flush, with no hardware visible from this side. Only a slight gap at the edge revealed its presence at all. Felder said, "That's the vault door. The mechanical lock is on the inside of that wall, accessed from the workshop side by a key that should be somewhere in this room according to your grandfather's notes. We don't have to find it today. We can come back with a locksmith." Clara looked at the cabinet labeled documentation, which was directly above the part of the bench closest to the vault door. She thought, he was a precise man, a man who organized his work for himself, a man who would have wanted the key where he could reach it from where he sat. She opened the cabinet. Inside were file boxes, 6 of them, each one labeled with a year range. 1971 to 1980, 1981 to 1990. The decades laid out in order across the shelf. The 6th box was unlabeled. On top of the boxes, lying flat on the cabinet shelf where any reasonable person would put a thing they wanted to remember the location of, was a small brass key on a leather thong. The key had been polished. It was bright and clean in a way that nothing else in the cabin was bright and clean, which was how Clara understood that it had been the last thing her grandfather touched in this room before he left it for the final time. She didn't pick it up. She looked at Felder. He came over and stood beside her. He looked at the key on the shelf. He looked at the cabinet of labeled file boxes. He looked at Clara and at the closed vault door at the end of the workbench. He said, "I think you should be the one to open it the first time. Not me. Not a locksmith. You. Before any of the rest of what's coming starts to happen." She looked at the key for a long moment. Then she took it. The leather thong was soft. She'd expected it to be cracked or brittle, but it was supple, as though it had been oiled regularly. The brass of the key was warm despite the cold of the cabinet, the way brass sometimes was for no reason Clara had ever understood. She walked to the vault door. There was a keyhole now visible at chest height, on the side of the door that had been invisible until you looked closely. The key fit. She turned it. The mechanism inside the door engaged with the soft, precise sound of well-machined parts moving against each other. The door swung inward. The vault was not large. Maybe 10 feet by 12, lit by a small overhead light that came on automatically when the door opened, powered by some kind of battery system Clara couldn't see and didn't try to understand. The walls were lined with shelves from floor to ceiling, and the shelves were full. What Clara had glimpsed through the crawlspace hatch 3 weeks ago, what she'd seen scattered on the floor and assumed was broken glass. She understood now that it had been a small spill, a handful of stones that had fallen, perhaps when one of the shelves shifted slightly, perhaps when something inside one of the boxes had broken open. A handful, out of what stretched in front of her now in steady, organized abundance. The shelves held boxes, small wooden boxes, mostly, the size and shape of jewelry boxes, but heavier, more deliberate, with the kind of joinery that suggested they'd been made by someone who built boxes for a living. Each box was labeled with a small printed card slotted into a brass frame on its front face. The cards bore catalog numbers, dates, brief descriptions in her grandfather's handwriting. Ruby, Burmese, for 0.2 carats, untreated. Sapphire, Kashmir, 6.8 carats, cornflower. Alexandrite, Russian, 3.1 carats, certified. Paparazka, Sri Lankan, 5.4 carats. Hundreds of boxes. She'd read enough during the 3 weeks of waiting to know what some of the catalog notations meant. Burmese ruby of any size and quality was the most valuable colored stone on Earth. Kashmir sapphires from the original 19th century deposits had been depleted for over a century, and any stone with a documented Kashmir origin was effectively unfindable in the modern market at any price. Russian Alexandrite from the original Ural Mountain source was equally rare. Untreated stones, stones whose color had not been altered by heat or chemicals, were worth multiples of what otherwise comparable treated stones commanded. Almost every card she could see from where she stood bore some variation of the word untreated. She did not yet have a number for what was in the room. She didn't try to construct one in her head. The number, she understood, would come later, in formal appraisals by experts, in reports that would run to many pages. What she could see now was something more basic. A man had spent 50 years selecting examples of the very best of a particular kind of beauty. He had stored those examples here, in this room, in this order. And he had left it, intact and inventoried, for her. On the wall directly opposite the door, a larger frame held a single document, glass-fronted and matted. A certificate of geological survey, dated 2018, with diagrams of the corundum vein running through the eastern acreage of the Harrow Falls property and notes on projected yield over a 50-year extraction window. On a small table in the center of the room sat a leather-bound journal and an envelope. The envelope was addressed in her grandfather's handwriting to a single recipient. The handwriting said, "For my granddaughter, if she finds me." Clara stood in the doorway and could not move. Felder, behind her, said very quietly, "Take your time." She did. She took as long as she needed. She stood there with the cold settling around them and the owl, she imagined, still on the roof, patient as it had always been, and she let what she was looking at become real in her mind. Stone by stone, box by box, year by year, the accumulated work of a man who had spent his life learning a particular kind of beauty and had stored what he found in a sealed room in the woods, waiting for her. She thought he was an artist. She thought, this is his archive of 50 years of his attention. She walked into the room. She walked to the table in the center. She picked up the envelope addressed to her, but she didn't open it. Not yet. She put it back where it had been. She picked up the journal. The first page bore a date, January 12, 1996. Below it, in his careful hand, "Today I started keeping a separate record from my working logs. The working logs are professional. This will be the other thing. The personal accounting. The notes I make when I want to write something down that isn't about the stones themselves." She turned the page. The entries were not daily. They were occasional. Months sometimes passed between them. April 3, 1996. Sylvie called. First time in 7 years. She didn't want anything. She wanted to tell me she was all right. I asked her where she was, and she wouldn't say. I asked her to come home, and she said she couldn't yet. I told her I loved her. She said, "I know you do." That was the whole of the conversation. Clara closed the journal. She stood in the vault and held it against her chest and breathed for a moment, and then she opened it again. September 11, 1998. Sylvie wrote a letter. She has a job. She didn't say where. The handwriting is the same as it was when she was a child. She used to write notes and leave them on my workbench when she was small, asking me what I was doing, asking when I would be done so we could go out. I have all of those notes still. I have them in a box. I have everything she ever gave me. She has no idea. December 24, 2001. No word for 2 years. I've stopped expecting. I'm trying to learn to be patient in a way that doesn't require a future event. To love a person who isn't with you and may not come back and is not, in any active sense, available to receive your love. It's a practice. I don't know if I'm any good at it. March 15, 2007. She's dead. They reached me through the state. They wouldn't tell me where she'd been living. They wouldn't tell me anything about her circumstances. They said the body had been identified through dental records. They said she'd been in a state program. They said her remains were going to be cremated and held for 30 days in case of family claim. I'm driving to claim her tomorrow. I don't know what else to write. I don't know what else to do. Clara turned the page. There was a long gap. The next entry was dated almost 2 years later, January 18, 2009. I learned this week that I have a granddaughter. The information came indirectly, through a state worker who told me too much by accident and then refused to clarify when pressed. Apparently, my daughter had a child. The child was placed in foster care after Sylvie's death. The child's name is Clara. The child would now be approximately 5 years old. The state will not tell me where she is. The state will not tell me whether she is all right. The state has a system of sealed records for the protection of children, which I understand and would normally support, but which in this case I find unbearable. I have hired a private investigator. I have written a letter to the governor's office. I have called everyone I can think of. I am told that the records cannot be opened. I am 68 years old. I do not know how long I will live, but I will spend whatever time I have looking for her. Clara closed the journal again. Felder, behind her, said nothing. The cold in the vault was deep but not unbearable. Clara stood in the middle of the room with the journal in her hands and the boxes of stones on every shelf around her, and she felt something she had no name for. It was something like being seen, but it was happening backward through time, with someone who could not see her now. A man had loved her without ever having met her. He had spent 10 years of his life trying to find her. He had failed, and in the failing, he had built this room and arranged what was in it, and he had left it sealed against the possibility, which he had not been able to verify, that she would eventually arrive. She put the journal back on the table. She picked up the envelope addressed to her. She didn't open it, not in front of Felder. There would be time later. She turned to Felder and said, "Let's go to town. There's too much here. I need to think." They closed the vault behind them. They closed the workshop and the main room and the foyer and the outer door, and Felder put the broken padlocks in a plastic bag he'd brought for that purpose, and they walked back through the unbroken snow to the fire road and to his four-wheel drive, and they drove down out of the woods in a silence Clara was grateful for. Felder didn't ask her questions on the drive. He didn't offer commentary. He didn't try to help her process what she'd just seen, which she appreciated, because she was not ready to be helped to process anything. He dropped her at Mrs. Bedell's at 3 in the afternoon. He said, "Tomorrow we begin the formal inventory. I'll arrange for a gemological appraiser and a fine art assessor to come up from Burlington. They'll need to be under non-disclosure before they enter the property. Are you all right?" She said she was all right. She wasn't sure that was true, but it was the answer the situation called for. He said, "One more thing. There's going to be activity around this. The court filing of your hereditary claim is public record now. Crestline Holdings knows. Your grandfather's broader circle in the gemological community may also have heard. We should expect attempts to contact you. I'd advise you not to respond to anyone directly without going through me first." She nodded. She thanked him. She walked up the stairs to her room and sat on the narrow bed and held the envelope from the vault in her hands. She'd put it inside her parka, against her chest, on the walk out of the cabin. It was warm now from being against her body for the better part of an hour. The paper of the envelope was thick and cream-colored. The seal on the back was unbroken. Her grandfather's handwriting on the front said, "For my granddaughter, if she finds me." She opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. She opened it carefully, holding it by the edges, because the paper felt important and she didn't want to mark it. The date at the top was September 14th, 2016. The same year he'd filed the will. "My dear Clara, I don't know if you exist. I'm writing this to a person I have inferred from records and rumors, and one piece of information given to me by a state worker who said more than she meant to, and then refused to confirm what she'd said. I know your name only because of her. I have been told that I am not allowed to know more, and I have respected that requirement to the extent that I have not pursued you through means that would have caused harm to others. I have stopped short of any action I believe you would not, when you are old enough to consider it, have wanted me to take. I hope I have made the right choices on your behalf. What I want you to know, if you ever read this, is that I have loved you in the abstract for the 7 years since I first learned you might exist. I understand this is a strange thing to read from a man you have never met. I understand it makes claims on you that you have not given permission for me to make. I'm sorry for that. But the alternative would be to lie to you about the shape of my life, which has been organized for the past several years around the possibility of your eventual arrival, and lying to you in a letter you will only read if I am no longer alive to answer for what I've written feels worse than the imposition of telling you the truth. I built this archive over the course of 50 years before I knew you existed. Most of what is in it I would have collected anyway, because I love what I love and I have spent my life accumulating examples of it. But the archive's purpose changed in 2009. After I learned about you. After I understood that the work of my life would need to be passed forward and that there was someone, possibly, who might be in a position to receive it. I want you to know that none of this is meant to make you into anything in particular. You are not obligated to be a gemologist. You are not obligated to keep the collection together. You are not obligated to value the things I valued. The contents of this room are yours to do with as you choose. And if what you choose is to liquidate everything and use the proceeds for something completely unrelated to what I built, that is a choice I have already accepted in writing it to you here. What I ask, the single request, is this. Do not be afraid of having what you have. Do not feel that you do not deserve it. Do not believe the voice, which you have probably heard many times from people who do not understand you, that says you should give it all away because it is too much for one person to hold. It is not too much for you. You are the inheritor I prepared for. You are the person I built this for. Receive what is yours. If you choose to share it with others afterward, that's your prerogative, and I will not posthumously judge what you do. But I want the first decision you make about this inheritance to be the decision to claim it, not to apologize for it, not to minimize it, to claim it, because it is yours, and it has been yours since I wrote your name into my will in 2016, when I was 85 years old and still hoping I might one day meet you in person. I never did meet you. I am sorry for that. I imagine I would have liked you. I imagine you would have found me difficult and quiet, and probably not the grandfather you'd have invented for yourself if you'd had the chance to invent one. But I think we might have liked each other anyway, given time. I would have liked to know what you looked like as a child. I would have liked to know what you've grown into. I would have liked to hear your voice. Be well, Clara. Be careful with the things in this room. Be careful with the lawyers and the people who will appear when they understand what you have. And be kind to yourself, which is a thing I learned too late and want you to learn now, while there is still time. Your grandfather, Elias Whitmore. She read the letter 3 times. The first time quickly, the way you read something to find out what it says. The second time slowly, the way you read something to find out what it means. The third time she did not read at all. She held it in her hands and looked at it without reading the words. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and put it back in the envelope, and put the envelope in the drawer of the small nightstand beside the bed, under a folded pillowcase, because she didn't yet have a better place for it, and she wasn't ready to invent one. She lay on the bed and looked at the ceiling and breathed. After a while she got up and went downstairs and ate a piece of toast in Mrs. Bedell's kitchen because she'd missed lunch and she felt slightly faint, and Mrs. Bedell, who was at the table with the newspaper, looked at her over the top of her reading glasses and said, "You all right, dear?" Clara said, "Yes, I'm all right. It was a long morning." Mrs. Bedell said, "You let me know if you need anything." Clara said she would. She went back upstairs and slept for an hour and woke up and went to her evening, which was the part of the day she usually spent at the library reading, except that today she didn't go to the library. She sat in her room and looked at the wall where the postcard had hung and thought. The next morning, she worked her shift at the diner the way she always worked her shift. Peg said nothing. Derry said nothing. The regulars said nothing because they had nothing to say about her ever, and that hadn't changed yet, and would not change for at least another day, because the news, when it came slowly in a town like Harrow Falls. It came on the second day. He came into the diner just after noon. A tall man in his late 40s wearing a dark wool coat that had been tailored, with the kind of haircut that signaled either money or the desire to appear to have money. He sat at the counter and ordered coffee and a sandwich, and he was friendly with Peg in a practiced way, the way someone who handled people for a living was friendly when he wanted information. Clara, who'd been watching him from the moment he walked in because watching strangers was something she'd developed as a habit very early in her life, brought him his coffee. He looked at her name tag, which said only Clara, no surname, and he smiled at her with the kind of warmth that had been calibrated by extensive practice. He said, "Clara, that's a nice name. Where are you from, Clara?" She said, "A few different places." He said, "Sure. Well, I'm in town for a few days, looking into some property interests in the area. Real estate development. Maybe you can help me. I'm looking for a woman by the name of Clara Voss, who I'm told works at this diner. Would that be you?" Clara set down the coffee carefully. She said, "Yes." He extended his hand across the counter. He said, "Marcus Thorne. I represent Crestline Holdings. I think your attorney may have mentioned us. I was hoping we might be able to have a brief conversation about some of the questions on the table." Clara did not take his hand. She said, "My attorney has asked me not to communicate directly with anyone involved in the estate without his presence." Thorne's smile didn't waver. He said, "That's reasonable advice. May I leave my card, in case you'd like to set up a meeting with him present?" She accepted the card. She set it on the counter beside his coffee. She said, "I'll pass it on." He thanked her. He drank his coffee and ate his sandwich and tipped generously, in a way calibrated to be noticed by the staff, but not so generous as to seem like a bribe, and he left. He waved to her on the way out. He smiled at Peg. He thanked Derry, by name, which Clara understood meant he'd asked around about the staff before coming in. After he was gone, Peg looked at Clara across the empty counter and said, "That a friend of yours?" Clara said, "No." Peg said, "He was asking about you before you came in. Yesterday afternoon. I didn't tell him anything." Clara looked at Peg. Peg said, "I don't know what your situation is, kid, and I'm not asking. But that's the kind of man whose business you should be careful with." Clara said, "Thank you." Peg said, "You need anything from me, you ask." It was the longest exchange they'd had in 11 weeks of working together. Clara nodded. She went back to refilling coffee and clearing tables and taking orders. But she could feel the shape of the town shifting around her, the slow tectonic adjustment of a place that had heard something it hadn't been certain about before and was now turning, slightly, in her direction. Felder called her that evening at 6. She took the call on the rooming house's hallway phone, which Mrs. Bedell let her use without commentary on the duration of the call. He said, "A complication." She waited. He said, "A man named Howard Whitmore has filed a claim against the estate. He's contesting your hereditary status." She said, "How?" Felder said, "His attorney filed papers this afternoon in the probate court in Burlington. He's claiming to be Elias's first cousin once removed, through Elias's father's brother. The genealogy he's presented appears to be authentic. He's not contesting that you're Sylvie's daughter. He's contesting that Sylvie was eligible to inherit at the time of her death, and therefore that her line is not eligible to inherit through her." She said, "I don't understand." Felder said, "The argument is technical. He's claiming that Sylvie was formally disinherited by Elias in 1991, and that her exclusion from the estate means her descendants are also excluded by extension. He's produced what he claims is a letter from Elias to a previous attorney stating the intent to disinherit Sylvie. He's arguing that this letter constitutes a controlling document despite not having been filed with the will of 2016. She thought about her grandfather's journals, the entries about Sylvie, the man who had kept every note she'd ever written to him in a box. She said, "He didn't disinherit her." Felder said, "I don't think he did either. But the letter Howard's attorney has produced needs to be examined and either authenticated or discredited. That will take time. In the meantime, the probate of the cabin contents is suspended." She said, "How much time?" He said, 2 to 3 months. Possibly longer if Howard's team is aggressive about appeals. She said, "And Crestline." Felder paused. He said, "I was going to ask you about that. We need to talk about Howard's funding. Whatever this case is going to cost him, it's going to cost him a great deal, and he doesn't appear, from what I can tell about his personal circumstances, to have the resources to fund it himself." She said, "A man came into the diner today. He said his name was Marcus Thorne. He represented Crestline." Felder was quiet for a moment. He said, "Did you talk to him?" She said, "I told him I couldn't communicate without you present. He left his card." Felder said, "Bring it to me tomorrow. And Clara, please, if anyone else contacts you, refer them to me. Don't be polite about it. Don't soften it. Just refer them." She said she would. She hung up the phone. She stood in the hallway for a moment with her hand on the receiver and thought about her grandfather's letter, which was upstairs in the nightstand drawer. The instruction in the letter: "Do not be afraid of having what you have. Do not feel you do not deserve it." She went upstairs and took the letter out of the drawer and read it again. Then she put it back. Then she sat on the bed for a while. In the morning, before her shift, she walked to the town hall and asked Walter if he had a few minutes. Walter put down the file he was reading and gestured to the chair on the other side of the counter. He said, "You've got that look. Something's happened." She said, "A man named Howard Whitmore has filed a claim against my grandfather's estate. He says he's a cousin of Elias on Elias's father's side. I wondered if you'd ever heard of him." Walter thought about it for a while. He did not pretend to recognize the name immediately, which she appreciated, because pretense in either direction would have wasted both their time. He said, after a moment, "Whitmore is not a name from around here, except for Elias and his father before him. Avery's people were from Massachusetts. I remember Avery mentioning a brother once, but I don't think they were close. The brother stayed in Massachusetts, as I recall. Avery was the one who came up. The brother would have had children. The brother's children would have had children. That's where your Howard would have come from, if his story is true." She said, "His story includes a letter from my grandfather, dated 1991, supposedly disinheriting my mother." Walter looked at her for a long moment. He said, "That doesn't sound like something Elias would have done. From what little he said about his daughter, he wasn't a man who'd written that kind of letter." She said, "My attorney thinks it's a forgery." Walter said, I expect it is. He paused. You're going to need people in this town who'll stand by what they remember about Elias if the matter goes to a hearing. I knew him a little. I know other people who knew him a little. None of us knew him well, but we knew enough. If you need depositions about who he was as a person, what he was like when he came up here, what kind of man he was, you tell your attorney to come talk to me. I'll write down what I remember. I'll get the names of others who'd do the same. She felt the shape of something shift in the air between them. She said, "Why are you offering this?" Walter said, "Because Elias bought from my store and used my records office and was decent to me every time I saw him for nearly 30 years. And because you came in here looking for information and asked the right questions in the right order." He looked at her steadily. "People in Harrow Falls aren't fast, but they pay attention. We saw who arrived and how. We noticed things." She thanked him. She walked back through the cold toward the diner and her shift, and for the first time since she'd arrived in October, she felt something that wasn't quite belonging but was adjacent to it. The town had begun to consider her. The verdict was not yet in, but the town was watching, and what it was watching was no longer just a girl with a second-hand coat working the morning shift. The next 2 weeks moved through her like cold water. She worked her shifts. She met with Felder in his office on Birch Street twice more. She drove to Burlington with him once to give a sworn deposition about the circumstances of her arrival in Vermont and the nature of her relationship to the documents her mother had left behind. She read Howard Whitmore's filing in its entirety, all 47 pages of it, and made notes in the margins of her own copy that Felder said she should keep for her records. The letter Howard had produced as evidence of Sylvie's disinheritance was a single page, dated August 20th, 1991. It was addressed to a man named Charles Reardon, who according to Howard's filing had been Elias's attorney in the early 90s. The letter said, in 3 brief paragraphs, that Elias had decided to exclude his daughter Sylvie from any future inheritance, that this decision was final, and that Reardon should prepare documentation accordingly. It was signed Elias Whitmore. The signature was a reasonable approximation of the signature on documents Clara had seen in the file from Felder's office. Felder said, when they looked at the letter together, "This is forged. Probably skillfully. But the signature isn't quite right, and the language doesn't match how your grandfather wrote in 1991 based on the other documents we have from that period. He used different vocabulary. He structured sentences differently. He spoke about Sylvie in entirely different terms, including in private letters from that exact year that we have in our possession." She said, "Can we prove it's forged?" He said, "We can hire a forensic document examiner. We can present the journal entries from the same period as comparison documents, which will show Elias writing about his daughter with love and concern, not with the intent of formal disinheritance. We can demonstrate that the letter contradicts the actual operative will of 2016, which names you specifically, and which was filed properly, and which Elias would have had no reason to file in conflict with a prior intent he'd never modified." She said, "How long?" He said, "It depends on how the court treats Howard's filing. The forgery defense will require expert testimony and time. The probate may remain in limbo for the duration. But we can win this. I think we will win this. I think the journal entries alone may be sufficient to discredit the letter without even needing to demonstrate forgery, because they show a man who loved his daughter and was searching for her descendant, which is not consistent with someone who had deliberately disinherited her line." She nodded. She said, "What do we do in the meantime?" He said, "We wait. We prepare. We protect what's at the cabin from any attempted access by Howard or by Crestline. I've petitioned the court for security on the property, which has been granted. The state will have someone check the property twice weekly until the matter is resolved. I'd advise you to stay in Harrow Falls. Don't travel. Don't make any statements to anyone outside this office. Don't engage with Marcus Thorne or anyone else who claims to represent Crestline or Howard Whitmore." She said she understood. She drove home through the cold and the early dark, alone now in Felder's old loaner sedan, which he'd let her borrow for the drive back, because Mrs. Bedell's Subaru had finally given up its ghost the previous week, and Clara hadn't yet found another arrangement. The road from Burlington wound through hills she'd never paid attention to before her grandfather's existence had reorganized her sense of the state. Now she looked at them and thought about what was underneath them. Stone, pressure, time, the slow accumulation of conditions that produced, occasionally, something extraordinary. She thought about her mother at 22, about the photograph of Sylvie on the porch laughing, about the journal entry from 1996, in which Elias had written that Sylvie had called for the first time in 7 years, just to say she was all right, and had not asked for anything. A man who had written those entries had not, in 1991, decided to formally disinherit his daughter. She pulled into Harrow Falls a little after 9. She returned the loaner to Felder's office, locked the keys in the drop box, and walked the 6 blocks to Mrs. Bedell's with her hands in her pockets and her breath coming in clouds and the 7 feathers, which she'd taken to carrying with her now, still in the inside pocket of her parka. She went upstairs. She lay on the bed. She thought about the cabin in the woods, sealed again now, but legally hers, the boxes of stones waiting on the shelves, the journals on the table, the photograph of her mother on the desk. She thought about Howard Whitmore, whom she had never met and probably would never meet, who was trying to take from her something her grandfather had spent his life preparing for her arrival. She thought about Marcus Thorne in his tailored coat, smiling with practiced warmth at the diner counter. She thought, I am not afraid of having what I have. She thought, I am the inheritor he prepared for. Outside the small window of her small room, the snow had stopped. The night was clear and very cold. Somewhere to the north, in the pine woods, on the slope of Greer's Ridge, the cabin sat in its clearing in the moonlight, and on the roof, she imagined, the owl had returned, or was still there, or had always been there, watching with its patient yellow eyes the place that had once been her grandfather's archive and was now hers. She slept badly that night and woke at 4 in the morning, the way she'd woken on December 14th, with the cold pressing against the window. She got up. She put on her parka. She went outside into the back garden and stood there in the snow. There was no feather. The feathers had been a beginning. The beginning was over. She looked north, in the direction of the ridge. She thought about her grandfather's letter in the drawer upstairs and her grandfather's journals on the table in the vault and her grandfather's name on a will from 2016 and her own name written into it. She went back inside and made coffee in Mrs. Bedell's kitchen and sat at the table and thought through what would need to happen in the months ahead. Not abstractly, concretely. The forensic document examination, the deposition schedule, the community in Harrow Falls, which had begun to notice her in a way that might become useful or might become dangerous, depending on how she handled it. The cabin under court-ordered security. The contents of the vault preserved but inaccessible to her until the legal questions were resolved. She drank her coffee. She thought about her mother in the photograph on the desk in the cabin, the full laugh, the head tilted back, a young woman at home in the world. The world had not been kind to her mother. The world was not going to be kind to her either. She understood this with the clarity of someone who had been failing to be surprised by the world for most of her life. But she had something her mother had not had at 22 on that porch in summer. She had a grandfather who had loved her without ever having met her. She had a letter in a drawer that told her to claim what was hers. She had Felder, who was good at what he did, and Walter, who would help her if she asked, and Peg, who had volunteered something it had taken her 11 weeks to be willing to say. She had the cabin and what was in it. She had her own name. She was 19 years old. She had $412 in October. She had, now, a court-recognized claim to an inheritance whose final valuation she didn't yet know, but whose lower bound was $47 million, and whose upper bound was something Felder had carefully refused to estimate in front of her. The men in tailored coats were coming. The forged letters were coming. The probate fights and the appeals and the maneuvering by attorneys whose names she didn't yet know. Let them come. She finished her coffee. She rinsed the cup and put it in the dish rack. She put on her uniform and her apron and her wool hat with the mended hole. She walked through the dark pre-dawn to the diner on Main Street, where Peg was already there with the lights on and the coffee started, and Derry was at the grill with his back to the door the way he always was, and Clara took her place at the counter and began the day's work without saying anything to anyone except hello. In the woods, the cabin waited. In the city, the lawyers worked. In the world beyond Harrow Falls, the slow weight of what she had inherited began, very gradually, to shift in her direction. The fight was going to be long, but the inheritance, Felder had told her, was already legally hers. They were not arguing about whether she would receive it. They were arguing about when and on what terms. She had time. She had patience. She had been waiting her whole life for something to belong to her. She would not stop now. The forensic document examiner Felder retained was a woman named Dr. Patricia Lynn, who had spent 23 years at the FBI's Question Documents Unit before opening a private practice in Boston. She came up to Burlington on a Tuesday in early February. She examined the original of the disputed 1991 letter for 6 hours in a conference room at the Burlington courthouse, with court-appointed observers present, while Clara waited in a smaller room down the hall with Felder and drank coffee from a vending machine that produced something more like brown water than coffee. Dr. Lynn emerged at the end of the day with 3 pages of preliminary findings. The signature was a competent forgery, she said, but a forgery nonetheless. The ink had been analyzed and the formulation was consistent with inks manufactured in the period 1985 to 1995, which on its surface supported the document's claimed date of 1991. However, the chemical aging of the ink showed inconsistencies that suggested the document had been written far more recently than 1991, possibly within the last 2 years, using ink either retained from an older stock or specifically obtained for the purpose of creating the document. The paper itself was period-appropriate but exhibited signs of artificial aging at the microscopic level. The signature, when compared to authenticated signatures from the same period, showed the characteristics of a careful tracing rather than a natural rendering. The pressure points where the writing instrument had paused or changed direction did not match the rhythm of natural handwriting. The forger had been competent, but the forgery had been done in a rush by someone who did not have time to develop the kind of fluency that would have made the signature pass closer examination. The conclusion of her preliminary report was that the document was a recent forgery. She would prepare a full report for court submission, but the preliminary findings were clear enough to share with counsel immediately. Felder shook her hand. He said, "Thank you, Dr. Lynn. This is exactly what I needed." She said, "Always glad to help an estate work through this kind of thing." She left. Felder turned to Clara and said, "This is very good for us. This is the foundation of our case. Combined with the journal entries we already have, the forgery defense becomes nearly impossible to overcome. Howard's team will know this within 48 hours. They'll have to make a decision about whether to continue or to fold." Clara said, "Will they fold?" He said, "I think their funders will instruct them to fold. The cost of continuing is going to outpace what they can plausibly recover, and the legal exposure for filing knowingly forged documents in probate court is severe. If we win, which we will, we'll have grounds to refer the matter for criminal investigation. Howard Whitmore and his attorney would face fraud charges. Crestline's involvement, if we can establish it, would be a much larger problem for them than the mineral rights they're trying to acquire." She thought about Marcus Thorne in his tailored coat at the diner counter. She said, "How do you establish Crestline's involvement?" He said, "Discovery. If the case continues, we get to look at Howard's communications, his bank records, his attorney's records. The trail to whoever funded the forgery will be visible. Crestline understands this, which is why they'll want Howard to fold before discovery starts. They'll cut him loose and try to insulate themselves." She said, "And then," he said, "then you receive the inheritance in full, and we proceed to the question of the mineral rights, which is a separate matter with a separate framework. Your grandfathers will prohibit the sale of the mineral rights for 25 years. That provision is valid under Vermont law. Crestline can wait 25 years if they want, or they can try to negotiate a lease arrangement that doesn't violate the prohibition, or they can move on. None of those options give them what they were trying to get when they pressured the estate during probate. The mineral rights remain yours." She nodded. They drove back to Harrow Falls in silence. In the week after Dr. Lynn's report was filed, Felder took Clara to see the Burlington residence for the first time. It was a narrow 3-story brick townhouse on a quiet street near the lake, the kind of building that had been built in the 1890s for someone with some money, and that had passed through many hands before her grandfather had bought it in 1974. The estate's caretaker, a woman named Helen Marsh who had been hired by the probate trust to maintain the property during the years of legal limbo, let them in. The house was as her grandfather had left it. Books in the library on the 2nd floor. A study on the 3rd floor with a different workbench from the one at the cabin, set up for fine work that didn't require the cabin's specialized equipment. Photographs throughout the house, mostly of stones, some of Sylvie as a child, some of a woman Clara understood after a moment was Sylvie's mother, her own grandmother, who had died in 1996, and whom Clara had never been told about in any of the case files she'd grown up with. She stood in the library looking at a wedding photograph from 1967. A young Elias, thin and serious, beside a woman with dark hair and the same light eyes Clara saw in her mother's photograph and in her own face. The woman was looking at Elias the way people looked at things they had chosen and were going to keep. Helen Marsh stood at a respectful distance. She said, "He spoke about you sometimes in the last years. He believed you would find the cabin eventually. He said the cabin was easier to find than this house because the cabin had the right kind of approach, the right kind of distance. He thought if you came at all, you'd come there first." Clara said, "He was right." Helen Marsh nodded. She said, "He was usually right about that kind of thing." They drove back to Harrow Falls in silence. The depositions of Harrow Falls residents took place over the course of 4 days at Felder's office on Birch Street, with a court reporter present and Howard Whitmore's attorney present by phone, listening from his office in Boston. Walter Greer testified for an hour about his encounters with Elias over the years, about what Elias had said about his daughter, about Elias's character as Walter had observed it across nearly 3 decades of intermittent contact. He said, on the record, he was a man who paid for his coffee in exact change. He was a man who returned a book he'd borrowed from my brother in 1987 with a note thanking my brother for the use of it and apologizing for keeping it longer than he'd intended. He was not a man who would have forged business with a daughter he loved. He spoke about Sylvie the few times he mentioned her with the kind of carefulness people bring to subjects that matter to them. The notion that he disinherited her formally is, in my judgment, as someone who knew him a little, implausible. 3 other people testified that week. Ray Norris, who'd been the postmaster in Harrow Falls from 1978 to 2014 and who'd handled Elias's mail when Elias was in town. A woman named Edna Sterling, who'd been a clerk at the county library and had occasionally helped Elias find old land records during his visits. And Peg Halverson, of all people, who Clara had not known had ever spoken to Elias and who turned out to have served him breakfast on perhaps 24 mornings spread across 30 years, and who described, when asked, a man who tipped consistently, who said please and thank you, who once on a winter morning had paid for the breakfast of a young woman 2 stools down whose card had declined and who had not been told who had paid for her. He had asked Peg, that day, to please not mention who had covered the bill. And Peg had not, until now, under oath, when she was being asked specifically about who Elias had been. Felder put the depositions into the file alongside Walter's. He said to Clara afterward, "This is a much stronger record than I had hoped for." The cumulative weight of these statements, combined with the journal entries and the forensic findings, makes the contest essentially unwinnable for Howard's team. I expect a withdrawal within the next 10 days. The withdrawal came in 8. Howard Whitmore's attorney filed the formal notice on a Friday morning. The document was brief. The claim was withdrawn without prejudice, which in the legal context meant that Howard reserved the theoretical right to refile, but that practically the matter was over. The probate court entered an order the same day affirming Clara's status as the sole heir to the Whitmore estate, lifting the hold on the cabin's contents, and releasing the various accounts and assets that had been frozen during the contest. The total time from her first walk into Felder's office to the probate's final resolution was 4 months and 11 days. Marcus Thorne came back into the diner on a Saturday morning in late February. He sat in the same seat at the counter as before. He ordered the same coffee and the same sandwich. He waited for Clara to come and refill his coffee, which she did because she was not going to let him think she was avoiding him, and he looked at her with the same calibrated warmth as the first time. He said, "Miss Voss, may I have a moment?" She said, "My attorney can be here in 10 minutes if you'd like to wait." He said, "This isn't a legal matter. This is a courtesy call. May I have 2 minutes of your time? Not at this counter. Just by the door, where we can speak privately." She glanced at Peg, who had positioned herself within hearing distance of the counter without appearing to. Peg gave her a small nod that meant whatever she chose was fine. Clara took off her apron. She walked to the foyer of the diner with Thorne following. He said, in a lower voice than the counter would have allowed, "I want you to know that Crestline Holdings is withdrawing all claims related to the Whitmore estate. We will not pursue the mineral rights at this time. We will not pursue them in the future under the terms of your grandfather's will. We understand that the matter is closed." She said, "Thank you for telling me." He said, I also want to say something personally, which is not on behalf of Crestline. I read the materials your attorney filed last week, including some of the deposition statements from people in this town. He paused. My company was wrong to pressure your grandfather's estate. The pressure compounded after his death in ways I personally regret. I am sorry for the part one played in it. She looked at him. She said, Are you saying you knew Howard Whitmore was forging documents? He said, I'm saying I did not know that. I am saying that the company I work for was looking for any legal mechanism to access the mineral rights, and that mechanism, when it was offered by a third party we did not directly fund, was something we were not careful enough about questioning. The chain of responsibility is unclear, but the moral responsibility is not. We were wrong. I am saying so directly, not because there's any legal advantage in it, but because it should be said. She thought about this. She said, I'm not the person you owe the apology to. My grandfather is the person you owe it to. I can't accept it for him. Thor nodded. He said, I understand. He paused, and then he said, You may also want to know that I'm leaving Crestline at the end of the month. I am not going to another firm in the same industry. I have not yet decided what I'll do next. But I won't be in this kind of work anymore. She said, I wish you well. He said, Thank you. He extended his hand a second time, the way he had at their first meeting. This time she took it. He left without finishing his coffee. Peg, watching from the counter, raised an eyebrow at her as she returned and put her apron back on. Clara said, He won't be back. Peg said, Good. The full appraisal of the cabin contents took 6 weeks. Felder coordinated the team. A gemologist from the Gemological Institute of America's New York office came up for 3 separate visits, each one lasting several days, accompanied by a security escort and a court-appointed observer. A fine art appraiser from a Boston firm came for 1 visit and produced an inventory of 7 paintings and 3 small sculptures that had been stored in a closet off the main room, which Clara had not even noticed during the first walkthrough. A mineral rights specialist reviewed the geological survey and produced an independent valuation. A general assets specialist cataloged the books, the furniture, the personal effects, and a small wall safe in the bedroom that Clara had also not noticed and that contained, among other things, a collection of investment-grade gold coins and a small stack of bearer bonds from the 1970s. The numbers came back in stages. The gemstones, in total, were appraised at $278 million at conservative valuations and significantly higher if individual pieces were sold to top-tier collectors in the right market conditions. The collection included 3 stones the gemologist described as world-class, meaning that the existence of each had been independently noted in gemological literature even before Clara's inheritance was made public. 2 of these were Burmese rubies of exceptional color and clarity, each over 7 carats, with documented provenance going back to the original mining in the early 20th century. The third was an alexandrite of just under 5 carats that the gemologist said was probably the finest example of its type in private hands. He had handled the stone twice in the course of the appraisal, once under direct sunlight from a high window and once under incandescent light from a desk lamp. And Clara had stood beside him both times and watched the stone shift from a saturated bluish-green in the daylight to a deep raspberry red under the lamp. The same stone. 2 different stones. The strangest and most beautiful thing she had ever looked at. He had said, holding it carefully between 2 fingertips, This is what your grandfather spent his life looking for. He found this in 1983. I read the paper he wrote about it the year after. I have wanted to see this stone for almost 40 years. He set it down with the care of someone returning a relic to its altar. The art collection was valued at $11 million. Most of this was concentrated in 2 paintings. An early child Hassan Harbor scene that Felder said her grandfather had purchased at auction in 1993, and a small Winslow Homer watercolor of the Maine coast that he'd bought through a private dealer in 1988. The other works were of more modest value, but included 2 pieces by regional artists Clara had read about during her library afternoons, and a small sketch by a Vermont landscape painter who'd become widely known after his death. The mineral rights, held in trust under the will's 25-year prohibition on sale, were valued at $89 million based on the corundum vein survey. The valuation was for accounting purposes only. The actual realization of that value would occur, if at all, after the prohibition period expired, and only if Clara or her heirs chose to lease or develop the rights. The Burlington estate, previously valued at $47 million, remained unchanged. The wall safe contained gold coins valued at $4.2 million and bearer bonds with current redemption values totaling $6.8 million. Additional investment accounts in Elias's name, which had been frozen during probate and which were released to Clara following the resolution of Howard's claim, contained $17.4 million in equities and fixed income securities. The total, when Felder added it all together for her on a single sheet of paper in his office on the first Monday in April, came to $414 million and change. He set the paper on the desk between them. He said, "This is the formal accounting. The valuation of the Gemstone collection in particular is conservative. If you choose to sell any of it through the appropriate channels, you would likely realize higher prices. Most of the wealth is intangible assets that don't generate income on their own, so we'll need to talk soon about your priorities. Liquidation strategy, tax planning, charitable giving, if that's something you want to consider, living arrangements, personal security." She looked at the sheet of paper. She looked up at Felder. She said, "I need a day." He said, "Take a week." She drove home from Burlington that evening. She did not go directly to Mrs. Bedell's. She drove instead to the diner and ate a meal she did not pay for because Peg, when Clara sat at the counter, looked at her face and brought her the plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes that was the daily special and waved off her offer to pay. Peg said, "It's on the house tonight, kid. You look like you've had a day." Clara said, "I have." She did not explain. Peg did not ask. She walked from the diner to Mrs. Bedell's in the dark. She let herself into the house quietly. Mrs. Bedell was in the kitchen with a cup of tea and a crossword puzzle, and she looked up when Clara came in, and she said, "There's hot water in the kettle if you want a cup." Clara made tea. She sat at the table across from her landlady. After a while she said, "Mrs. Bedell, I want to tell you something that's going to happen. I don't want you to hear it from anyone else." Mrs. Bedell set down her crossword. Clara said, "The legal matter I've been working on with Mr. Felder has been resolved. My grandfather left me a substantial estate. I'm going to be moving out of the room at some point in the next few months. But before I do that, I want to ask you something. I want to ask whether you'd be willing to help me with a project I'm planning. I'm going to need someone with experience running a rooming house, and I don't know anyone else who's done it well." Mrs. Bedell looked at her for a long time. She said, "I've been running this house for 31 years. Clara said, "I know." Mrs. Bedell said, "What kind of project?" Clara said, "Housing for young people who've aged out of foster care. People like I was 4 months ago. 6 apartments. Furnished. No background checks. Stable rent for as long as they need it. I want it to be a real home, not a program. I want someone running it who knows what that means." Mrs. Bedell was quiet for a longer time. She said, "Finally, how much would you pay me?" Clara said, "Whatever the work is worth. Whatever you decide." Mrs. Bedell said, "I'll think about it." She picked up her crossword puzzle. Clara finished her tea. They sat together in the warm kitchen for another 20 minutes, neither of them saying anything else, and then Clara went upstairs to bed. In the morning, on her way down to her shift, she found a note on the kitchen table. It said, in Mrs. Bedell's careful hand, "I'll do it. We can talk about the money later." Clara took the note. She put it in her parka pocket beside the 7 feathers and the business card from James Felder and the photograph of her mother on the porch laughing that she had taken from the cabin desk and made a copy of and now carried with her. She went to the diner. She worked her shift. At 3 in the afternoon, after the lunch crowd had thinned, she sat at the counter with Peg and explained, in more careful detail, what she was planning. Peg listened without interrupting. When Clara was finished, Peg poured them both a cup of coffee from a pot that had been sitting for an hour. She said, "You're going to need a place where people eat. A free meal a couple times a week. Anyone in the program can come." Clara said, "Yes." Peg said, "I can do that. I'm open 6 to 9. I can clear the back tables on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Anyone you send me eats free." Clara said, "I'll pay for the food." Peg said, "Cost only. No markup. And don't argue with me about it." Clara said, "I won't." Peg said, "Good." She drank her coffee. She said, after a moment, "I knew your grandfather. I served him breakfast for 30 years. I told the lawyer that under oath last month, and I'll tell it to you now." Clara said, "Why didn't you mention it before?" Peg said, "Because it wasn't my business to. And because I wasn't sure you'd want me to." People have a way of feeling crowded when too many strangers claim to have known someone they're trying to figure out. I figured you'd hear it from the deposition, which you did. She paused. She said, he was a quiet man. Polite. Not friendly exactly, but decent. I liked him fine. He used to read the paper at the counter and ask me how the road conditions were on the ridge before he drove up. Once he bought breakfast for a girl whose card declined. He told me not to mention it. I respected that for 30 years. I respect it less now, because I think he might have wanted you to know that he was the kind of man who did that. He was the kind of man who paid for a stranger's meal. Clara said, thank you. Peg said, don't thank me. He's the one who did the thing. Clara drove out to the cabin 2 days later, on a Wednesday, alone, in a four-wheel drive she'd bought used for the purpose, the first significant purchase she'd made with the funds Felder had released for her ordinary expenses. She drove up the fire road in dry winter sun, parked at the turnaround, walked the unbroken path through the pines to the clearing. The owl was on the roof. The owl was always on the roof, except when it wasn't, and Clara had stopped trying to predict its presence and had begun to accept its presence as a feature of the place. She unlocked the cabin with the keys Felder had given her after the probate. Resolution. She went inside. She lit the fire her grandfather had laid years ago in the stone fireplace, and the dry split would caught quickly, and the room began to warm for the first time, she suspected, since the spring of 2019. She sat in one of the green wool armchairs and watched the fire. She thought about what she wanted. She thought about Mrs. Bedell's rooming house and Peg's diner and Walter at the records office and Dorothea at the library, all of whom would still be there, doing what they did, regardless of what Clara decided. She thought about the cabin and the gemstones and the mineral rights held in trust for 25 years. She thought about her grandfather's instruction to claim what was hers without apologizing for it. She thought about being 19. She thought about being 12 and 17 and 7 and 4. She thought about all the houses and the night she had aged out and the bus to Burlington and the dot on the map. She thought, I want this place. I want this cabin. I want Harrow Falls. I want to live where my grandfather built his archive. I want to spend my life around the stones he chose. I want to honor what he left. And I want to do for other people what no one did for me. She drove back to town. She went to Felder's office at 4 in the afternoon. She sat across from him at his desk. She said, here's what I want to do. She laid out the framework as she had been thinking through it on the drive. She wanted to keep the cabin and the property. She wanted to keep the most significant pieces of the gemstone collection together, intact, as her grandfather had assembled them, possibly with the eventual goal of creating a small private museum on the property or in Burlington. She wanted to liquidate the secondary holdings strategically over several years to fund the work she had in mind without flooding the market or attracting unnecessary attention. She wanted to maintain the mineral rights as the will required and beyond, possibly indefinitely, because she did not need the money and the land deserved to remain whole. And she wanted to use a portion of the wealth, to be determined, to establish a foundation focused on aging out foster youth in Vermont. Not a charity in the usual sense. Not a system that handed out grants to existing programs. A foundation that provided direct, sustained, individual support. Housing, mentorship, education, tools. The things she had not had at 19, and that she now knew, with the clarity of someone who had been on both sides of the divide, made the difference between making it and not making it. She said, I want a young person who's about to age out, or who has just aged out, to be able to come to Harrow Falls and have a real chance at a life. Not a 6-month transition program. Not a referral to a list of resources. An actual base of operations. Housing that's stable. A community that knows their name. Work if they want it. Training if they want it. Time to figure out who they are without the cliff edge of poverty. Felder listened without interrupting. When she was done, he said, this will take significant planning. The legal structure for the foundation, the operational planning, the property acquisitions, the staffing decisions. It will be a multi-year effort to do it well. Are you prepared for that? She said, I'm 19. I have time. He said, I think this is a good plan. Your grandfather would approve. She said, I think he would. She drove home that night to Mrs. Bedell's rooming house, where she still had her room and her 7 feathers on the windowsill and her postcard on the bedside table, and she slept the kind of sleep she had not slept in a long time. A sleep without watchfulness. A sleep that belonged to someone who knew where she was going to be when she woke up. The next morning, she resigned from the diner. She gave 2 weeks' notice, which Peg waved off, saying she could leave whenever she wanted because they both knew she had work to do that was more important than refilling coffee. Clara stayed the 2 weeks anyway. It felt like the right thing to do. On her last day, the regulars at the counter wished her well. Some of them shook her hand. The man who always ordered the cheese omelet with extra hash browns gave her a card he'd made himself out of cardstock, with a drawing on the front of a cabin in the snow that he could not have known about because Clara had never told him. It was just the kind of cabin small-town men drew when they were drawing cabins. Inside the card he had written, "Good luck, kid. You did well in this town. We're glad you came." She kept the card in the drawer of the nightstand beside her grandfather's letter. She moved into the foundation house on the 1st of May. The house was on the north side of town, 3 blocks from Main Street, an old farmhouse on 2 acres that had been empty for several years and that she had bought outright in March for $185,000. The renovation took 8 weeks. She did some of the work herself with help from a contractor in town named Henry Doyle, who'd offered his services at fair rates when he'd heard what the house was being used for. By the end of June, the main residence had been restored and a separate caretaker's apartment had been added above the renovated garage, and Mrs. Bedell, who had finalized the terms of her new position the previous month, was settling in. By the following autumn, the Whitmore Foundation for Transitional Youth had its first office on Main Street, in a building Clara had bought outright the previous May. The first floor housed the foundation's small staff. A director Clara had hired, a woman in her 40s named Rebecca Cho, who'd spent 15 years running a similar program in Massachusetts, and who had been the first person Clara had called when she was ready to start. A part-time bookkeeper, a part-time case manager. The second floor of the building was being prepared as transitional housing for the first cohort, 6 small apartments, each one fully furnished, available to young people who'd recently aged out of care or were about to. Free rent for up to 2 years while residents found their footing. The first resident moved in on October 16th. Her name was Mira Reyes. She was 18 and a half. She'd aged out 3 months earlier in Rutland and had been couch surfing with limited success until a caseworker who'd heard about the foundation had sent her north. She arrived with a duffel bag and a backpack and the careful watchfulness Clara recognized from her own mirror a year earlier. Clara met her at the door. They went upstairs to the apartment that would be Myra's for as long as she needed it. Rebecca had already filled the kitchen with basic supplies. There was a bed made with new sheets. There was a desk under a window that faced Main Street. There was a small framed print on the wall above the bed, which Mira looked at with the kind of attention people gave to things they were trying to understand without being too obvious about it. Mira said, "That's a nice picture." Clara said, "A friend of mine had it." She said she'd never been able to say what it meant. Then she figured it out, and she didn't need it on her wall anymore. It was the postcard, reframed, the winter landscape, the light in the window. Mira looked at it for a moment longer. She said, "It feels like coming home." Clara said, "I know." She showed Mira the rest of the apartment. The small kitchen with its full set of dishes and pots and a stocked pantry. The bathroom with new towels folded on the shelf. The closet with hangers ready for clothes Mira didn't yet have, because she'd be getting them in the next few days with the help of Rebecca, who'd taken 3 young women to the same department store in Burlington 4 times this fall and was getting practiced at it. She told Mira where the laundry was and where the keys were, and how to reach the foundation office downstairs if she needed anything. She told her where Peg's Diner was, and that Mira could eat there free on Tuesday and Thursday evenings as part of the program. She told her where the library was, in case she wanted to use a computer or check out a book. She told her, last of all, that the program was real, that the housing was hers for 2 years if she needed it, that nobody was going to ask her to leave, that she didn't have to perform recovery or gratitude or anything else to keep the apartment. She just had to be here. Mira sat down on the bed. She said, in a voice that was steadier than her face, "I didn't think this was real until I walked in just now." Clara said, "I know." Mira said, "You did this." Clara said, "A lot of people did this. I just had the idea and the resources to start." Mrs. Bedell runs the building. Rebecca runs the program. Peg feeds you. Walter at the records office will help you with any paperwork the state still has on you. Dr. Markham at the clinic will see you for free if you need a doctor. Henry Doyle did the renovation work and gave us a deal he'll never make up. The town's been part of this from the start. Mira said, "Why?" Clara said, I'll tell you my story sometime, if you want. But not today. Today you should unpack. You should sleep. You should know that you have nowhere to be tomorrow except here, where you live now. Anything else can wait until you've slept. She left Mira to settle in. She walked back down to the foundation office, where Rebecca was reviewing applications from 3 other young people who'd reached out in the past 2 weeks. She walked through the work that needed to be done that afternoon. She went to the diner at 5, where Peg now greeted her by name when she came in, and Derry slid her a plate of whatever he'd made too much of without being asked, and she ate at the counter and read the file Rebecca had given her about the next applicant. At 7, she drove out to the cabin. The road to the cabin had been improved with funds from the foundation. Not paved, because the cabin wasn't meant to be easily accessible, but graded properly and maintained, so the 4-wheel drive could make the trip without difficulty. The clearing had been left intact, but a small caretaker structure had been built at the edge of it, where someone from the foundation could stay during periods of intensive use. The cabin itself remained largely as her grandfather had left it. Clara had not redecorated. She had added nothing to the desk in the main room. She had moved nothing in the workshop. She had cleaned and maintained, but not altered. She let herself in. She lit the fire. She sat at the writing desk under the east-facing window, which she had unshuttered after the second visit, so the light could come in now during the day. The photograph of her mother on the porch was still there, in its frame, in the same spot her grandfather had kept it. Clara had added one thing, and only one thing, to the desk, a second photograph, in a frame she'd bought to match the first of her grandfather. The picture had been taken at a gemological conference in 2004. He was standing in front of a display case, looking at something inside it with the careful absorption Clara had seen in the deposition photographs, and in the journal entries, and in every account of him she had accumulated over the past year. The 2 photographs sat at the back of the desk, side by side. Her mother laughing. Her grandfather paying attention. The only family she had ever seen pictures of, both of them long gone. Both of them now in the room he had built and she had inherited. She opened the notebook her grandfather had closed for the last time 5 years ago. She had not written in it before. She had read his final entries. She had let it sit on the desk through the spring and summer, waiting to be ready. The last entry he had made was dated July of 2019. It was a short entry. He had written, "I am not well. I have known for some months. I do not have much time left. I have done what I can with the time I had. The archive is complete. The will is filed. I have left instructions for whoever finds her when she comes. I have done what I know how to do. If you are reading this, Clara, I hope you are all right. I hope you are kind. I hope you are happy. I hope the world has been gentle with you. I am sorry I could not be there to make it so." She read the entry through twice. Then she picked up the fountain pen her grandfather had capped and left in the tray. She uncapped it. She wrote in the notebook on the page following her grandfather's final entry. She wrote the date at the top, October 16th, in her own handwriting, which was different from his but recognizable, she had been told once by a teacher, as the handwriting of a person who paid attention. She wrote, "I'm here. I found the cabin. I found the archive. I read your letter. I want you to know I am all right. I want you to know I am kind. I want you to know that I am, at the moment of writing this, happy. Happier than I have ever been in my life. The world has not always been gentle, but it has, in the end, been just gentle enough. I have started something with what you gave me. I think you would approve. There is a girl named Mira sleeping tonight in an apartment above the foundation office on Main Street. She is the first. There will be more. I will spend my life on this work. It will be slow and it will be difficult, and I will not always be good at it. But I will do it for as long as I am able, because of what you did for me, which was to believe in me without ever having met me, and to leave me the tools to do for others what you would have wanted to do for me. I'm sorry we never met. I would have liked you. I would have liked to know what you sounded like when you laughed. I would have liked to ask you about the stones. I would have liked to hear you talk about my mother. I have your archive. I have your cabin. I have your name, which I have taken back, because Voss was someone else's name and Whitmore is mine. I am Clara Whitmore. I am here in Harrow Falls, in your chair, at your desk, writing in your notebook. The fire is going in the fireplace. The owl is on the roof, the way it always is. I think the owl was always you. In some way I don't fully understand. I think it has been watching over the place since you couldn't anymore. Thank you, grandfather. Thank you for finding me before I knew I was looking. Thank you for the inheritance. Thank you for the letter. Thank you for the years you spent believing in someone you had never met. I'm here. I will not waste it. Clara, she capped the pen. She set it back in the tray. She closed the notebook. She sat in the chair for a while, watching the fire, with the photographs of her mother and her grandfather on the desk, and the journals of her grandfather on the shelf, and the vault behind the workshop wall, and the cabin and the woods, and the ridge, and the town, and the small foundation office on Main Street, with a young woman sleeping safely on the second floor. Outside, on the roof, the owl shifted slightly, spread its wings, slowly, the way it had spread them in the clearing 11 months ago when she had first stood there in the snow with 7 feathers in her hand. Settled them again. The snow had begun to fall. It was the first snow of the season. Soft and continuous, the way Vermont snow always fell, the way the world worked, indifferent to the weight of any single moment. Clara watched it through the unshuttered window. She thought about the 7 feathers in the box on her dresser at the foundation house she'd moved into in May. She thought about Mira Reyes upstairs above the office. She thought about the girls and boys who would come in the years ahead, who would find their way to Harrow Falls because someone had heard about Clara's story and pointed them north. She thought about her grandfather at the same desk, decades earlier, writing the entries she had read in the journals on the shelf. A girl had once stood in a clearing in the snow, holding 7 feathers, and looked at a sealed cabin she had no claim to. A woman now sat at her grandfather's desk in that cabin, in firelight, with snow falling outside and her own name written into a journal her grandfather had stopped writing in the year before he died. The inheritance had been many things. The gemstones, the cabin, the money, the land, the mineral rights held in trust, the journals. But the inheritance had been other things too. The belief, the years of looking, the polished brass key on the shelf, the fire laid in the hearth, waiting to be lit by someone who would come, eventually, even if her grandfather had not been able to see how. She had been the someone. She had come. She was here now. And she would do, with the rest of her life, what her grandfather had done with his. Pay attention to what mattered, hold on to what was worth holding, and leave behind, for someone she might never meet, something worth finding. Outside, the owl watched. The snow fell. The cabin stayed warm. Clara Whitmore, finally, was home. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.